How can Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré defy the West? Africa News 2025. The piercing sound of sirens echoed across the capital city of Ouagadougou on a tense morning in late September 2022. Soldiers blocked the main roads, armored vehicles rolled through dusty streets, and anxious families huddled inside their homes, uncertain about the future. Radios crackled with urgent announcements. The government had fallen. A 34-year-old army captain named Ibrahim Traoré had seized power in a dramatic coup. For many outside observers, this moment seemed like just another story of instability in West Africa. But for the people of Burkina Faso, tired of corruption, foreign exploitation, and a war that left villages in ashes, it felt like the first breath of freedom after decades of suffocation. Burkina Faso had long been plagued by insecurity. Armed insurgents linked to extremist groups terrorized towns, displacing over 2 million people. Families fled from burned villages, schools closed under the shadow of violence, and farmers abandoned fields that had fed generations. The government seemed powerless, and worse, many citizens believed that the country's resources were being plundered by foreign powers, while ordinary Burkinabé suffered in silence. Against this backdrop of despair, Ibrahim Traoré emerged not just as a soldier, but as a symbol of defiance. Who is this young man that dared to challenge the old order? Born in 1988 in the Haute-Bassin region, Traoré was not from a wealthy elite family but from humble roots, shaped by the struggles of ordinary Burkinabé life. After joining the military, he served in the artillery and witnessed firsthand how ill-equipped soldiers were sent to confront ruthless militants. His frustration grew as he saw lives lost, while leaders in suits negotiated contracts with foreign companies that seemed to benefit everyone except the people of Burkina Faso. Then came the breaking point. In 2022, as violence escalated and the government of Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba failed to deliver security, young officers in the army whispered of change. Traoré, respected for his calm determination and courage, became the face of this revolt. Within days, the Damiba government collapsed, and Traoré addressed the nation. "Our country is in danger. We must take our destiny into our own hands." Ordinary people, farmers, mothers, students, spoke of Traoré as the heir to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated in 1987 who had once inspired Africa with dreams of independence and justice. Suddenly, a young captain carried the burden of a nation's hope. Yet the story of Burkina Faso is not only about one man. To understand why millions rallied behind him, we must look deeper into the country itself. Burkina Faso is a landlocked nation in the heart of West Africa, bordered by Mali, Niger, Ghana, Benin, Togo, and Côte d'Ivoire. With a population of over 23 million, it is one of the youngest nations on Earth. The median age is under 18. More than 60 ethnic groups coexist here, each with its traditions, languages, and music. Despite poverty, despite conflict, Burkinabé people are known for resilience, warmth, and an unshakable pride in their culture. But history weighed heavily. Once known as Upper Volta, Burkina Faso was a French colony carved into existence not for its people, but for the interests of empire. Independence came in 1960, but economic chains remained. French companies controlled much of the mining sector, especially gold, the country's most valuable resource. Ordinary families saw little of the wealth extracted from their soil. Meanwhile, decades of political instability, military coups, assassinations, weak civilian governments left deep scars. By the early 2000s, Burkina Faso had become a frontline in the global war on terror. Militants infiltrated from Mali and Niger, striking villages and towns with brutal efficiency. In 2021 alone, more than 2,000 people were killed in terrorist attacks. Schools were shut down, over 5,000 by 2024, leaving nearly 1 million children without education. For many Burkinabé, the nation seemed to be collapsing. This was the environment that Ibrahim Traoré inherited. When he took power, Burkina Faso was one of the poorest countries in the world, with a GDP per capita under $900. Nearly half of the population lived below the poverty line. Families in the countryside survived on subsistence farming, but recurring droughts and the spread of conflict meant hunger was rising. Insecurity forced many to abandon their land, swelling the number of displaced persons in camps with little food or shelter. The capital city, Ouagadougou, was both a symbol of resilience and of inequality. Modern buildings stood beside slums of tin-roofed shacks. Traoré's first move was bold. He launched the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland (VDP) program, mobilizing ordinary citizens alongside the army to defend villages against militants. Thousands of young men and women answered the call, trading farming tools for rifles. Critics said it was reckless. Arming civilians could lead to chaos, but supporters saw it as the only way to survive. One farmer, interviewed in late 2022, said, "For the first time, we feel like the government is fighting with us, not above us." Traoré knew that true sovereignty required economic independence. He turned to Burkina Faso's gold sector, demanding that foreign mining companies renegotiate contracts so that wealth stayed in the country. In early 2023, he announced new gold refining projects to reduce reliance on Western corporations. He also called for food self-sufficiency, urging farmers to produce more maize and millet to cut dependency on imported grain. These policies were revolutionary for Burkina Faso, but they also carried risks. The international community, especially France, viewed Traoré with suspicion. His decision to strengthen ties with Russia and cut military cooperation with France was seen as a geopolitical gamble. To many in the West, Traoré was a destabilizing figure. But to millions in Burkina Faso, he was finally a leader willing to put the people before foreign interests. Still, the question remained. Could a 34-year-old captain with no experience in governance truly lead a nation through war, poverty, and foreign pressure? Could he live up to the legacy of Thomas Sankara without meeting the same tragic fate? This is the story of Burkina Faso under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a story of courage, defiance, and uncertain hope. It is the story of a people who refuse to surrender, even when the odds are stacked against them. And as we journey deeper, we must ask, is this the dawn of a new Africa, or merely another chapter in a cycle of struggle? But what happened when the world reacted to Traoré's defiance? Did Burkina Faso find support or isolation? The next chapter reveals the storm of responses that followed, and the high-stakes battle for the nation's future. The weeks following the September 2022 coup were electric, filled with both hope and fear. Ouagadougou, usually bustling with markets and music, became the center of demonstrations, speeches, and tense standoffs. People filled the streets waving Burkinabé flags, chanting the name of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. For the first time in years, ordinary citizens felt they had a leader who would not bow to outside pressure. Yet this new hope came with a heavy cost. Foreign powers, particularly France, did not take Traoré's rise lightly. French troops had been stationed in Burkina Faso for nearly a decade under the banner of fighting terrorism. But many Burkinabé viewed them not as saviors, but as occupiers who failed to stop the bloodshed. When Traoré demanded that French forces leave the country, the crowd erupted in cheers. It was a decision filled with risk, but also one that resonated deeply with a population that had grown weary of dependency. Within months, French military bases were emptied, their flags lowered in silence. That moment was a turning point, both symbolic and practical. To the Burkinabé, it meant sovereignty. To the French government, it was a humiliation. International news outlets ran headlines like "Burkina Faso expels France, the end of a West African partnership." Analysts in Washington and Paris warned that Traoré was pushing his nation into the arms of Moscow. Indeed, as French troops departed, Russian advisors and security contractors began to appear. Some hailed it as strategic pragmatism. If France had failed, why not try a new partner? Others feared it was simply trading one dependency for another. Traoré himself framed the move differently. Burkina Faso belongs to the Burkinabé. We will choose our friends and our future. Gold was the lifeblood of Burkina Faso's economy, accounting for over 70% of export earnings. Yet most profits went abroad, into the hands of multinational corporations. In early 2023, in a televised address, Traoré declared, "The wealth beneath our soil must feed our children, not foreign bank accounts." In the capital, miners and workers gathered to celebrate. In rural towns, families dared to dream that schools might reopen, that displaced villagers might return home, that poverty could finally be reduced. But foreign investors were alarmed. The London-based Financial Times warned of economic collapse if contracts are torn apart. Western diplomats cautioned against radical nationalism. New laws were drafted to increase Burkina Faso's share of mining profits. The government announced plans to build national gold refineries so that the raw gold would not be shipped abroad for processing. Ordinary Burkinabé, long shut out of their own country's wealth, watched closely. Meanwhile, the mobilization of the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDP, intensified. Young men, some barely in their 20s, received rudimentary training in rifles. They were sent to protect villages, schools, and farms. Mothers wept as their sons left home to fight, but there was also pride. "At least we are defending ourselves," one villager said. "No one else will do it for us." Would they turn into militias, threatening the very state they were meant to protect? The risks were real, but so was the desperation of a population tired of waiting for help that never came. Across the region, Traoré's defiance inspired others. In Mali and Niger, where similar frustrations boiled, citizens praised Burkina Faso's bold stance. By 2024, the three nations formed the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, a regional bloc promising military cooperation, economic coordination, and shared sovereignty against foreign interference. The announcement of this alliance was another high point in Traoré's story, a moment when Burkina Faso stopped standing alone and began forging a new regional identity. But with each bold move came backlash. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, warned Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger of isolation and even threatened sanctions. Western diplomats described the AES as a dangerous experiment. American officials expressed concern that the Sahel was falling into the orbit of Russia. Yet in Ouagadougou, the reaction was defiant. Citizens marched with banners reading, "We choose our future. Africa must be free." Standing on a stage draped in the national colors, he spoke not as a career politician, but as a soldier and a son of the soil. "We are not against the world. We are against exploitation. We are not enemies of the West, but we will no longer be slaves in our own land. If the price of freedom is hardship, we are ready to pay it." The crowd roared, some with tears in their eyes, others raising fists in the air. For many, it was the first time in decades that they felt ownership of their country's destiny. But outside Burkina Faso, skepticism grew. Western media often painted Traoré as reckless, inexperienced, and a puppet of Moscow. Inside Burkina Faso, opinion was more complex. Some feared that the young captain's defiance would bring economic punishment, making life harder. Shopkeepers in Ouagadougou worried about rising prices. Families displaced by conflict wondered whether rhetoric would actually translate into safety. The tension between hope and fear defined this period. For every farmer who praised Traoré for nationalizing gold, there was a mother asking when her children could safely return to school. For every youth celebrating the AES alliance, there was a businessman wondering whether sanctions would crush the economy. The stakes could not have been higher. Yet even as doubts spread, one fact was undeniable. Traoré had changed the conversation. Burkina Faso was no longer a silent victim of foreign influence. It was at the center of global debates about sovereignty, security, and the future of Africa. But bold declarations alone do not end wars or fill empty stomachs. As 2024 unfolded, Burkina Faso faced the hardest question of all. Could Traoré's revolution actually deliver for the people? And what price would ordinary families pay in this struggle for sovereignty? When Ibrahim Traoré seized power in 2022, he promised security, dignity, and sovereignty. But translating those words into daily reality for millions of Burkinabé proved far more complex. The consequences of his decisions, bold and defiant as they were, touched every corner of society, from families in rural villages to politicians in the capital. The results were mixed, moments of progress, flashes of pride, but also deep struggles and uncertainty. For ordinary citizens, the most immediate effect was the continued insecurity. Despite the mobilization of the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDP, extremist attacks did not simply vanish. Families in the northern and eastern regions still faced night raids by armed groups. Villages were burned, markets destroyed, and farmers displaced. By early 2024, the United Nations reported more than 2 million internally displaced people, many of them women and children. Camps sprang up around Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, where aid organizations tried to provide food and shelter. Life in these camps was harsh: overcrowded tents, shortages of clean water, and the ever-present fear of disease. Yet amidst this hardship, there was also a sense of empowerment. Communities that once felt abandoned began organizing themselves for defense. Local elders coordinated with VDP fighters, teaching them village traditions while also preparing for patrols. The state was fragile, but in the eyes of many, it was at least fighting alongside its people, not above them. One father of three put it simply: "Before, we waited for help that never came. Now we fight with our own sons. That gives us dignity." Politicians who had grown comfortable with foreign aid and contracts found themselves sidelined. Many ministries saw reshuffles, with younger officials and technocrats taking charge. Parliament, weakened by years of instability, was largely bypassed as Traoré ruled by decree. Supporters saw this as necessary during an emergency. Critics warned it was the beginning of authoritarianism. Civil society groups expressed concern that freedom of the press was narrowing, with some journalists detained for undermining security. By invoking the memory of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of the 1980s, Traoré positioned himself as the heir to a legacy of anti-imperialism and self-reliance. Murals of both Sankara and Traoré began appearing across Ouagadougou, painted by youth collectives. To many, it was as if history had looped back, giving the nation another chance to pursue Sankara's vision cut short by assassination. Economically, the effects were uneven. The renegotiation of mining contracts promised long-term benefits, but in the short term, foreign investors pulled back. The country faced reduced foreign aid, especially from Western donors displeased with Traoré's pivot toward Russia. This led to budget shortfalls, delaying infrastructure projects and limiting funds for health and education. Prices of imported goods rose, making life harder for urban families who relied on markets. Bread, rice, and fuel all became more expensive, fueling quiet frustration even among Traoré's supporters. But in rural areas, the campaign for food sovereignty sparked a revival. The government distributed seeds and encouraged cereal production. Fields of maize and millet expanded in some regions, giving hope that Burkina Faso could one day feed itself without relying heavily on imports. Women's cooperatives, supported by local councils, started processing grains into flour and porridge for displaced families. Though hunger remained severe, there was a new sense of local initiative. Politically, Traoré also redefined Burkina Faso's regional role. By forming the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, with Mali and Niger, he challenged the old dominance of ECOWAS. This move was popular domestically. Citizens saw it as standing shoulder to shoulder with neighbors facing the same struggles. But it also deepened isolation from West African countries aligned with Western partners. ECOWAS sanctions loomed, raising fears of trade blockades. Markets in the south that once bustled with cross-border commerce began to slow. Traders worried whether goods from Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana would continue to flow freely. For the Burkinabé youth, who made up 2/3 of the population, the changes were especially significant. Many saw Traoré as a role model, proof that young people could lead. Student unions organized rallies in his support. But unemployment remained a crushing reality. Without stable jobs, many young men turned to the VDP for purpose, while others considered migration, risking dangerous journeys across the Sahara toward Europe. This tension between pride in national sovereignty and the need for economic opportunity became one of the defining struggles of Traoré's era. On the social side, religion and tradition played critical roles in shaping reactions. Burkina Faso is a country where Islam and Christianity coexist with traditional beliefs. Religious leaders, imams, pastors, village chiefs began voicing support for national unity. In sermons and community gatherings, they emphasized that defending the homeland was not just a political duty, but a moral and spiritual one. Some compared the fight for sovereignty to the biblical struggle for deliverance. This blending of faith and nationalism helped sustain morale in times of hardship. However, not all reactions were positive. Human rights groups raised alarms about the conduct of security forces and VDP fighters. Reports of abuses, summary executions, and arbitrary detentions emerged, particularly in conflict zones. Families of the accused protested that justice was being bypassed in the name of security. Traoré's government denied systematic abuses, but admitted that discipline was a challenge when civilians were armed and thrust into battle. In the political landscape, opposition voices were weakened but not silenced. Some intellectuals argued that Burkina Faso risked replacing one form of dependency with another, shifting from France to Russia without truly achieving independence. Others cautioned that isolating from ECOWAS could strangle the economy, but among the masses, these critiques were often overshadowed by the immediate reality. After decades of feeling ignored, they finally had a leader who seemed willing to risk everything for their dignity. The duality of hope and hardship defined life in Burkina Faso by 2024. In the markets of Ouagadougou, women selling vegetables debated whether Traoré could deliver on his promises. In rural villages, farmers sowed seeds with renewed determination, but worried whether their sons would return from the front lines. In the halls of government, younger leaders pushed reforms while older elites grumbled in the shadows. This was not a revolution won overnight. It was a fragile, ongoing struggle. The outcome was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Burkina Faso was no longer a silent player in global politics. It had forced the world to pay attention. But how would the United States and the wider international community respond to this defiant shift? Would Burkina Faso find new allies to sustain its revolution, or face isolation and economic collapse? The next part explores the global dimension of Traoré's gamble and its implications far beyond Africa. As Burkina Faso under Captain Ibrahim Traoré charted a bold new course, the world could not look away. Every decision, expelling French troops, embracing Russia, nationalizing mines, joining Mali and Niger in the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, reverberated far beyond Ouagadougou. To supporters, Traoré was the face of African sovereignty. To critics, he was a reckless soldier, endangering stability in a fragile region. But for the United States, Europe, and the wider international community, the stakes were much larger than the borders of Burkina Faso. In Washington, policymakers viewed developments in the Sahel through the lens of national security. The U.S. had long invested in counterterrorism programs in West Africa, supplying aid, training, and intelligence. Yet, despite billions spent, the region remained plagued by violence. The rise of Traoré posed uncomfortable questions. Had decades of Western involvement failed? Was Burkina Faso's pivot toward Russia a signal that America was losing influence in Africa? Officially, the State Department urged restraint and called for a return to democratic governance. Behind closed doors, analysts debated. Some argued that Traoré represented a dangerous break from constitutional order and risked turning Burkina Faso into another authoritarian state. Others saw him as a symptom of deeper failures, proof that U.S. and French strategies had alienated populations rather than secured them. One think tank report put it bluntly: the West lost hearts and minds in the Sahel.
Traoré is the result.
For Paris, Burkina Faso was not just another African nation, it was part of France's historical sphere of influence. The expulsion of French troops in 2023 was a blow to national pride, triggering fiery debates in the French parliament. Some politicians demanded a harder line, while others argued it was time for France to accept that its era of dominance in West Africa was ending. French media often portrayed Traoré as a Moscow-backed puppet, amplifying fears of Russia's expanding presence in Africa. Russia, meanwhile, seized the opportunity. Moscow's outreach included promises of military training, arms supplies, and economic cooperation. Russian officials framed their involvement as support for true independence against neo-colonialism. State media showcased images of Burkinabé citizens cheering Russian flags alongside their own, presenting it as evidence of a new alliance. Yet, skeptics in Burkina Faso worried. Was Russia offering genuine partnership, or simply seeking influence in a geopolitically strategic region? China, too, watched closely. Already a major investor across Africa, Beijing signaled cautious interest in Burkina Faso's push for self-reliance. While not as vocal as Russia, Chinese companies eyed opportunities in infrastructure and trade, positioning themselves as alternatives to Western partners. In this great power contest, Burkina Faso had unexpectedly become a stage where global influence was contested. For ordinary Burkinabé, however, geopolitics often felt distant compared to daily struggles. A mother in a displacement camp did not care whether help came from Washington, Paris, or Moscow. She cared about whether her children could eat and go to school. Yet even she admitted that Traoré's defiance had given people a sense of dignity. For years, we were told what to do by outsiders. Now, we have a leader who says no. That matters. Some Western outlets depicted Burkina Faso as spiraling into instability, while African media highlighted the pride and unity emerging from the AES alliance. In the diaspora, Burkinabé communities abroad organized rallies, raising flags and chanting support for Traoré. For them, his leadership was not just about Burkina Faso, it symbolized a wider African awakening. But challenges remained severe. Terrorist violence still claimed lives weekly. Economic sanctions from ECOWAS threatened trade. Inflation bit into family budgets. And questions lingered. Could a young military leader deliver on promises of sovereignty without plunging the country into deeper hardship? Could a fragile alliance of Sahel states withstand international pressure? In the United States, these questions carried weight. Older Americans watching the Sahel saw echoes of history: Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, wars where foreign involvement promised stability but delivered disappointment. For them, Traoré's defiance was both intriguing and unsettling. Was he a freedom fighter reclaiming Africa's dignity, or another strongman dragging his nation into peril? The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere in between. By mid-2025, Burkina Faso stood at a crossroads. Its withdrawal from ECOWAS was scheduled, symbolizing a final break with a regional system many saw as compromised by foreign influence. The AES alliance promised solidarity but remained untested. Inside the country, morale was higher than in years, but resources were stretched thin. The future was unwritten. And so, the story circles back to the people. The families in Ouagadougou markets, the farmers in the north, the children studying under makeshift tents after their schools were closed by violence. For them, Ibrahim Traoré was not an abstract figure of geopolitics. He was the man who dared to say no when others bowed, the leader who risked everything to restore dignity. Whether he would succeed or fail was uncertain, but his defiance had already reshaped Burkina Faso's place in the world. As Americans over 60 watch this unfolding drama, the parallels are hard to miss. Just as their generation remembers battles for justice, sovereignty, and security during the Cold War, they now see a young African captain standing at the intersection of global power struggles. It raises profound questions about freedom, faith, and the cost of independence. Will Traoré's Burkina Faso become a beacon of resilience, showing that even small nations can defy empires? Or will it become another cautionary tale of idealism crushed by reality? The answer is not yet clear. But what is clear is this: the world cannot ignore Burkina Faso anymore. So we leave you with a question. Is Captain Ibrahim Traoré the hope Africa has been waiting for, or the risk that could plunge a fragile region into chaos? If this story has stirred something in you, whether anger, hope, or reflection, share your thoughts. Do you believe that justice, dignity, and sovereignty are worth the risks that Burkina Faso is taking? Because in the end, this is not only about one African nation. It is about the universal struggle for freedom, the desire to protect our families, and the belief that even against overwhelming odds, dignity must be defended. And as always, may God bless those who fight for justice. May He protect the innocent, and may He guide both Africa and America toward peace and truth. The story of Burkina Faso is still being written. The next chapter may hold triumph or tragedy. But one thing is certain: the world will be watching.